The Wicked Spectre. There was once upon a time a good old Cornish family of the name of Roswan. Well-born, well-to-do, gentle people they were, who had always lived in their own fine old house on their own estate, and never knew what it was to want any comfort or luxury. The family, in time though, grew larger than their income, and their pride and their dignity were greater than either, so that, in trying to support the large family according to their larger dignity, the poor little income got quite swallowed up, and the whole family of Roswan became involved in poverty and great difficulties. Mr. Roswan, the father of the last of the family to live on the property, employed for his lawyer and man of business an attorney called Ezekiel Gross. And, as so often happens, as fast as Mr. Roswan went down in the world, his lawyer went up. Ezekiel grew rich, no one knew how, and prospered in every way. Mr. Roswan grew poor, and lost in every way. Nothing on the property paid, and at last, to his great grief and never-ceasing regret, Mr. Roswan had to sell his beloved home and everything belonging to him. Then who should come forward to buy it, as soon as ever it was put up for sale, but his own lawyer, Ezekiel Gross. Everybody wondered, and most people declared that Ezekiel could not have made such a large sum honestly by his business, that he must have other and less straight methods of getting money. Anyhow, whether he made it honestly or dishonestly, he had enough to buy the estate he coveted, and as soon as the old family could turn out, he himself took up his abode in the fine old house, and a very proud man he was. If, though, he was a proud man as he sat in the spacious library, or wandered through the lofty rooms and noble old hall, he could not have been a very happy one, and very little enjoyment could he have got out of his new possession, for from the very hour he entered and took up his abode there, such unearthly and mysterious noises, such fearful screams and gruesome groans worried and haunted and dogged him, as made his hair stand on end, and nearly scared him out of his wits. A ghost, too, appeared in the park as soon as night fell. As Ezekiel crossed the park, he would be suddenly confronted by a white, worn face and a pair of great, ghastly, luminous eyes. It would rise up from the ground in front of him, or pop round trees and bushes at him, or, on raising his eyes, he would find it confronting him over a hedge, and before very long, the ghost, not content with making noises in the house and haunting the park, took it into his head to enter the house and make that his permanent home. When Ezekiel came face to face with him indoors, he thought he was not such a terrible ghost after all, and much of his fear left him, for the ghost, to look at, seemed only an infirm old man. Indeed, the lawyer found him less terrifying than the horrible, uncanny sounds which seemed to come from nowhere and could not be accounted for. By and by, though, the ghost's visits were repeated so often, and he began to make such mysterious signs and movements, that the surly lawyer soon lost patience, and before long grew so seriously angry that he determined to put an end to the annoyance and rid himself of his tormentor once and for all. The very next night, as Ezekiel sat alone in his office looking over some papers and making up his accounts, the ghost glided into the room as usual, and taking up his position opposite, at once began to make the usual mysterious and extraordinary signs. The lawyer was very irritable. He had lost an important case and was out of spirits. He was unusually nervous, too. For a while he bore the presence of the ghost and his extraordinary behavior with a certain amount of patience. Then suddenly he lost his temper. "For pity's sake, tell me what it is you want with me, and be done with it, can't you?" he cried angrily. The ghost immediately stopped his gesticulations and spoke. "Ezekiel Gross," said he, in a hollow, ghostly voice. "Ezekiel Gross, follow me. I can show you buried gold, the wealth for which thou longest." Now, no man in the world loved gold better than did the attorney, but he was anything but a brave man, and even he himself knew that he was not a good one, and the thought of going alone with this uncanny guide to some desolate spot where no one could see or hear him, if he called for help, made his teeth chatter and his knees tremble. He hesitated and gazed searchingly at the little old ghost, but to save his life he could not utter a word. He nearly suffocated with longing to possess the secret and know where the treasure lay, but he dared not ask. And all the time the spectre stood staring at him with unwinking, scornful eyes, as if the sight of the cowardly, trembling man gave him unfeigned pleasure. At length, beckoning Ezekiel to follow him, he turned and walked towards the door. Then Ezekiel, fearful of losing the secret and the wealth, threw aside every feeling but greed and sprang to follow. At least, he tried to spring, but so firmly was he secured to his chair he could not budge. "Come," said the ghost imperatively. Ezekiel tried again, but great as was his longing to find the gold, he could not obey. "Gold," whispered the ghost in a whining, craven tone. "Don't you hear me, man? Gold!" "Where?" gasped the lawyer, making another desperate struggle. "Come with me and you shall see," answered the spectre, moving further through the doorway, and the lawyer struggled like a madman to get free from the chair and to follow. "Come, man, come!" shrieked the ghost in a perfectly awful voice. "Ezekiel Gross, I command thee!" And with that, Ezekiel, by a power stronger than his own, was forced to rise and to follow the old man wheresoever he led him. Out through the hall they went, down through the park, and on by ways the attorney did not know, until at last they arrived at a little dell. The night was pitchy dark, and nothing could Ezekiel see but the ghostly figure gliding along ahead of him, all lit by a weird phosphorescent light. In the dell was a small granite cairn, and here the ghost stopped and looked around for the attorney. "Ezekiel Gross," said he, when Ezekiel had come up and was standing on the other side of the cairn. "Ezekiel Gross, thou longest for gold. So did I. I won the prize, but I found no pleasure in it. Beneath those stones lies treasure enough to make thee richer than thou hast ever dreamed of. Dig for it. It is yours. Obtain it and keep it all to yourself, and be one of the rich men of the earth. And when thou art happiest, I will come and look upon you." With that, the spectre disappeared, and Ezekiel, overcome with fright and amazement, was left alone by the cairn. "Well," he said at last, recovering his courage, "I don't care if you are a ghost or a devil. I will soon find out if you are telling me lies or not." A harsh laugh sounded through the darkness, as though in answer to his brave words, and once again the attorney trembled with fear. He did not begin his search that night, but taking careful note of the exact spot, he returned to his house to think over all that had happened. And what he decided was that he was not going to let any squeamishness stand in the way of a fortune. "I'll tip over the old cairn," he said, with a great show of coolness, "and I'll search every foot of ground under it and around it, and it shall not be my fault if the treasure is not found." So a night or two later, armed with a crowbar and other tools, away he started secretly, and found his way again to the lonely dell, where he soon dispersed the stones of the cairn and began his digging. The ground was hard and flinty, and the work anything but easy. But he had not far to dig before he came across something hard and round, which increased his excitement until it nearly suffocated him. Feverishly he dug and cleared away the earth until at last he had laid bare a large metallic urn sunk deep in the ground, an urn so large and heavy that though he used his utmost strength, and his strength by that time was almost that of a madman, he could not move it, much less carry it home with him, and having brought no light, he could not even examine it. So all he could do that night was to cover it over again with earth and replace the stones on top, so that no one, coming upon it, should guess that the cairn had been touched. Ezekiel scarcely knew how to live through the next 24 hours, and as soon as it was dark on the following evening, he crept out of his house with a dark lantern concealed beneath his cloak. He knew his way to the dell so well now that he reached there very quickly, and with very little trouble he threw down the cairn and laid bare the urn again. By the light of the lantern he soon forced open the lid. In spite of the trembling of his eager, covetous fingers, the lid off, he went to plunge his hand in boldly, when to his unspeakable delight he found the thing full to the brim of gold coins of all sorts and sizes, and from all countries, coins of the rarest and most valuable description. Glancing round every now and then to see that he was not followed, or that no one had come upon him accidentally, he loaded every pocket in his clothing with his treasure. Then he buried the urn, rebuilt the cairn, and hurried back to his house, anxious to conceal his wealth in a place of safety. From that time forward, whenever he could get out without arousing the suspicions of servants, he went night after night to the cairn, until he had brought away every coin, and had them all carefully hidden in Roswan house. And now, his treasure safe, himself the richest man in the county, Ezekiel Gross began to feel perfectly happy. He built new wings onto the old house. He laid out the gardens and made improvements everywhere, even in his own clothing and his personal appearance. The people round could not help noticing the changes that were taking place, the money that was being spent and the improvements that were being made. You may be quite sure, too, that the attorney took care to parade his wealth, for having money, a fine house, fine clothes, and carriages and servants, indeed, everything but friends, he began to want friends too, and people to whom to show off his grandeur. And before very long, though everyone knew his character, and what he had been and what he had done, the neighbouring gentry began to seek his acquaintance, and many of them declared themselves his friends. After that, the attorney broke forth in quite a new way. He began to give entertainments more lavish and splendid than anything of the kind ever known in the county. Everyone flocked to him. People plotted and struggled to get invitations from him. They quite ignored the fact that but a little while before he had been a poor rogue of an attorney whom they all despised, and that he had come by his wealth by means which no one had been able to fathom. They all seemed to be bewitched, to be under some spell. High revels were constantly held at Roswan House now, and the gayest and liveliest of all the people gathered there was the master himself. He was as happy at this time as a man could be, and a great part of his happiness was due to the fact that he had never set eyes on his ghostly visitor since the night he conducted him to the treasure in the dell. Months went by. The feastings and gaieties grew more and more splendid, the hospitality more and more profuse. Those who had not his acquaintance craved it, and everyone bowed before the Lord of Roswan, as in time he came to be called. Indeed, he went about as though he were the lord of the whole county, and everyone his inferior. He travelled always in a chaise and four. He kept numberless carriages, horses, servants. He was elected to every high position in the county, and he was never tired of preaching of the beauty of honesty and uprightness, and our duty to our poorer brethren. So things went on until one Christmas Eve, when there was gathered at Rosewarne a large company of the most beautiful and well-born of all the families in Cornwall. Such a gathering had seldom been seen as was gathered that night in the great hall for the ball Ezekiel Gross was giving, and in the kitchen was an equally large party engaged in the same form of enjoyment. Food and wine were provided in lavish profusion. Everything was on a most sumptuous scale. Merriment ran high. Everyone was in the gayest of spirits, and gayest of all was Ezekiel. Now he felt the power of wealth. Now he was positive that all other things were as nothing to it. For had it not made him the most popular, the most important, the most welcomed and sought-after man in the county? All had just reached the very highest pitch of myrrh and excitement that could be reached, when a sudden chill, as though the hand of death were on them, fell on the company. The dancing ceased. No one quite knew why, and the dancers looked at each other uneasily, each frightened by the other's pallor. Then suddenly, whence or how came, no one knew, in the middle of the hall they saw a little old man standing gazing at the host, with eyes from which darted a hatred which was perfectly venomous. Everyone wanted to ask who he was and how he had come, but no one dared. They looked at Ezekiel Gross, expecting him in his usually haughty way to demand what right he had there. But Ezekiel Gross stood like a figure hewn out of stone. It all took place in about a minute, and then the old man vanished in the same mysterious way that he had come. As soon as he had gone, the host, who a moment before had been petrified with terror, as quickly recovered himself and burst into uproarious laughter. It was forced laughter, though, unnatural mirth, as most of those present could not help feeling. "Ha ha! My friends, what do you think of my little surprise? How do you like my Father Christmas? Cleverly managed, was it not? But you all look rather alarmed by his sudden movements. I hope my little joke has not frightened you. Hand round the wine and punch there. Then we will on with the dancing again." Try as he would, though, he could not put new life into the evening's festivities. The myrrh was dead, the pleasure overcast, for there was still that strange, death-like chill in the air. The guests, frightened, and convinced that something was wrong, made various excuses, and one by one took their departure. From that evening everything was changed. Ezekiel Gross and his entertainments were never the same again. He never acknowledged any difference, and he gave more parties and issued more invitations than ever. But at every feast, every dance, every entertainment of any sort, there was always one uninvited guest, a little wizened, weird old man who sat back in his chair and never spoke to anyone, but gazed all the time at Ezekiel with stern, uncanny eyes, which frightened all who caught sight of them. Indeed, the effect he had on the guests was extraordinary. Under the chill of his presence they could not talk, or eat or drink, or keep up any appearance of enjoyment. Ezekiel was the bravest of them. He tried to encourage them to talk and laugh, talking and laughing loudly himself all the time, but all was unnatural. His apologies for his strange visitor were numerous. He was an old friend who liked to come to him and see new faces and young life, but was too old to do more than look on. He was deaf and dumb. That was why his conduct was so strange. Sometimes the little old man sat unmoved while these stories were told. At other times, though, he would spring up and with a burst of mocking laughter would disappear, no one knew how. By and by, of course, Ezekiel Gross's friends began to leave him. They declined his invitations and omitted to include him in theirs. so that in a comparatively short time he had not a single friend remaining of all those he had spent so much upon. Disappointed and miserable, he soon became the wreck of his old self. Alone in his luxurious house now, save for his old clerk, John Cull, he could never be said to be quite alone either, for wherever he went, or whatever he did, the spectre haunted him persistently. Under this persecution, the attorney became a broken-down, miserable man, with every feature stamped with terror. For a long time he bore with the merciless ghost without complaining, but at last he came to an end of his endurance. In heart-rending terms, with tears and piteous pleading, he begged the old man to go away and leave him. He had been punished sufficiently, he said, but his prayers were poured into deaf ears. The spectre absolutely refused to go, and for some time stuck to his word. Then at last he consented on one condition, and that was that Ezekiel should give up all his wealth to someone the spectre should name. "Who am I to give it to?" gasped Ezekiel humbly. "To John Cull, the man you have overworked and underpaid for years. John Cull, your clerk and dependent." Ezekiel Gross had been given wealth, happiness, friends, only to be deprived of all, to be lowered in the eyes of all men with no one to pity him. This was the punishment designed by the frightful spectre, who was no more nor less than an ancestor of the family Ezekiel Gross had robbed, the Roswans. He had planned to punish the lawyer by whose wickedness his family had been robbed and made homeless, and he carried through his plan. Poor Ezekiel Gross did not live long in his disappointment and shame. He was found dead one day with strange marks upon him, and people who saw it say that when he died, the weird little spectre stood beside him with a pleased smile on his face. As soon as it was dark, he disappeared, and the story goes that he took Ezekiel's body with him, for from that day to this, it has never been seen. The story of the Lovers' Cove. This is a sad story. At least, some will think it sad. It is not about fairies or giants or witches, but about two lovers who loved each other above and beyond everything else in the world, which is uncommon, for most people love themselves in that way first and someone else next. These two lovers loved each other passionately and devotedly. They used to meet in the Lovers' Cove, or Porfan Gwarfa, which means the same, and many a happy meeting they had, and well did everything go until they told their friends. After that, there was such a talk and such a stir and such hardness and misery that the lovers never again knew what it was to be happy. The parents said that they should not love each other, which was foolish, for they could not prevent it. That they should never meet and never marry, which was cruel, for this they could prevent, and did. So the poor lovers led a life of utter wretchedness, for they were persecuted, sadly, and were breaking their hearts for each other. At last their persecutors ended by driving the young man away. He determined to go to the West Indies. Then the relations congratulated themselves heartily that they had got their own way and parted the lovers forever. In spite of all their precautions, though, those two poor, heartbroken lovers managed to meet once more, and as it was to be their very last sight of each other, for they did not know how long, perhaps forever, it was a very, very sad parting indeed. It was in the Lovers' Cove that they met, and there, under the frosty light of the moon, they bade each other their sad goodbyes, and while they clung to each other for the last time, they made a solemn vow that, living or dead, they would meet again in that same place, at that same hour of the same day, 3 years hence. So the young man sailed away, and the girl lived with her parents, going about her duties quietly and patiently, and in spite of her sadness, with a look of hope in her eyes that increased and increased as the weeks and months slipped by. Her parents noticed it, and told themselves that she had forgotten the banished lover, and would soon learn to care for one of those they approved of. When, though, she had refused to listen to any of the others who came wooing her, they began to fear that they were mistaken, and were puzzled to know what it was that was driving the wistfulness from her face, and the languor from her step. So the long years dragged to a close, and at last, as it was bound to do, the end of the 3 years drew very near. And with each day the girl's step grew lighter and more buoyant, her eyes glistened and her lips curved in a smile that was new to them. Now and then even a snatch of song burst from them. Her parents had no doubt now that she had quite forgotten the lover whose name had not been mentioned in her presence since the day he sailed. Then at last the 3 years were really past and gone. The last day dawned, and wore away to evening, and then night fell. Moonlit, still, beautiful, a fitting night for lovers who were to meet once more, whether living or dead. In the cove it was as light as day. One could count each wave as it rose and fell, and see distinctly the white foam at its edge as it broke on the beach. The sands gleamed like silver in the sad white light, save where the rocks threw dark shadows. All round the coast the witches and wizards were busy manufacturing their spells. High up on a cliff, overlooking the Lovers' Cove, an old woman, not a witch, was sitting preparing her herbs and simples, which must always be done by moonlight, when suddenly she was startled to see down in the cove below her the figure of the maiden swiftly crossing the sands. The old dame, who recognized the girl, was startled, for it was nearly 12 o'clock, and in that part most people are in bed by 9. Swiftly and unhesitatingly the girl made her way to a rock far out on the sands, and close to the water. Up the rock she climbed, and sat herself down as though it had been noon on a fine summer's day. Did not she know, wondered the old woman nervously, that the tide was rapidly rising, and the rock being fast surrounded? Apparently, though, the maiden did not know or care, for there she sat immovable, her face turned towards the sea, gazing at it, with bright intent eyes as though searching its face for something. At last the old woman grew so alarmed she could endure the suspense no longer. The girl's danger increased every moment, and she felt it her duty to go and warn her, and give her what help she could. So with trembling limbs and fast-beating heart she hurried as fast as she was able down the side of the cliff. The path, though, was rough and winding, and she was old. At one point, the end of the beach where the girl sat was cut off from her view. It was only for a moment, certainly. Yet when the old dame caught sight of her again, she saw, to her amazement, that a fine young sailor had also mounted the rock, and was seated close beside her. He too, sailor though he was, seemed quite unconscious of their danger. They sat there on the water-surrounded rock, he with arm around the girl, she with her head on his breast, oblivious of everything but each other. "Oh, ho, my young woman," said the old dame to herself, "so this is how you pass your time while your lover is away, and after the way you pretended to love him too." She felt quite cross, for she was very tired and very frightened, and in no mood to smile at lovers' foolishness. She sat herself down on a rock by the path they would have to ascend, determined to await their return, partly to give the maiden a good sound scolding for her reckless behaviour, and partly to satisfy her curiosity by seeing who the young man was who had won her heart away from the absent lover. The lovers, though, appeared to be in no hurry to move. There they sat clinging together, with the moon shining down coldly on them, and the water gleaming around them. The wind had died away until there seemed to be scarcely a breath of air stirring, and the sea lay as calm as a lake. The whole scene resembled fairyland, with the lovers as two spirits watching over the cove. The tide rose higher and higher, and the only sound to be heard in that lone, desolate spot was the lazy plash of the waves on the shore and around the cliffs. In a short time, the water rose so high that the rock was almost covered. To get off it now, the lovers would have to swim, yet still they paid no heed. They seemed lost to everything but each other. It was all so ghostly and uncanny that the poor old woman grew wild with nervousness and excitement. She called and called to them at the top of her voice, but she failed to make it reach them. The plash of the waves and the sighing of the gently heaving sea seemed to swallow it up. And when at last a wave came up and washed right over them, she shrieked aloud, distracted by her own helplessness, and covered her eyes with her apron. She could not bear to look and watch them being drowned. With her face hidden, she waited breathless for their shrieks for help, but none came. She uncovered her eyes and looked at the rock. It was bare, save for the water which now covered it. She gazed frantically around, first at the beach, then out to sea. The beach was empty, save for herself, but out on the sea were the two lovers, floating out on the scarcely moving waters, hand in hand, gazing into each other's eyes, smiling happily and without sign of struggle. Further and further away they drifted. Then across the still waters came the sound of sweet, low voices singing, and in the stillness which hung over everything, the very words sounded distinctly. I am thine, thou art mine, beyond control, in the wave, be the grave of heart and soul. Slowly, slowly they passed out through the moonlit sea, sweetly chanting their pathetic song, until at last they turned and faced the shore. And in that moment the old woman recognized in the sailor the lonely maiden's lover, who had been driven away by her parents so long before. One long look they took at the lovers' cove and the black rock on which they had met, then turned their happy faces to each other, their lips meeting in one long, long kiss. And while their lips were meeting, they sank quickly beneath the waves. A few days later, the maiden's body was found not far from the lovers' cove, and some time after, news reached the village that on the very night that she had been seen with him on the rock, he had been killed in a foreign land. The Silver Table. Off Cudden Point, in the parish of Perranufno, there lies buried in the sea treasure enough to make anyone who finds it one of the wealthiest persons in the whole county. Now and then, during the spring tides when the water is very low, small portions of it are found, just enough to keep up the excitement and cause dozens of children from all the neighbourhood round to gather there in a swarm, to search among the seaweeds, and dig in the sands, and venture out in the sea itself as far as they dare. It is only about once in a blue moon that they do come upon treasure, but there is always the hope that any hour or day may bring them a big find. Jewellery and coins and silver goblets are some of the treasures they seek, but the greatest of all is no less a thing than a table, a large and massive table, too, made of solid silver. I am sure you would like to know why they expect such a prize, so I will tell you. Many, many years ago there lived in those parts a very wealthy man. He was also a very wicked one. Indeed, it was said that he was none other than the Lord of Pengurswick, of whom you will have read in another of these stories. It was rather difficult to say for certain, for the wicked old man, being an enchanter, could go about in all kinds of disguises, so that only those who had the gift of second sight could discover him. Anyhow, if this rich bad man was not the Lord of Pengurswick, he was someone just as wicked and just as rich. I believe, though, it was that old enchanter, and at any rate we will call him so for the time. The old gentleman had plenty of money, and he spent it freely too, for it cost him no trouble to get. He ground it out of the poor, and in the most cruel manner. As he got it so easily, he did not mind wasting it, and he kept open house, as they call it. That is, he always had a house full of visitors, men and women who were nearly as bad as he was, and he provided them with every kind of luxury and pleasure and amusement that he could think of. They rode pell-mell over the country on fiery, unmanageable horses, breaking down the farmers' hedges, trampling down the land, hunting, shooting, dancing, and gambling. They did anything and everything that was wild and foolish and exciting, in order to make the days pass pleasantly. One very, very hot summer's day, though, when the sun was pouring down pitilessly, scorching up everything, and there was scarcely a breath of air to be found, and it was too hot to dance or to ride or do anything tiring, this gay crew thought they would like to spend some hours on the sea, where it was cooler than on the land. So the Lord of Pengurswick, always glad to show off his possessions, ordered his largest and most sumptuous barge to be set afloat, and stored with every kind of luxury and every sort of dainty thing he could think of. And the gay party went on board, seated on silken cushions under an awning of cloth of gold. They began at once to feast on the marvellous dainties spread for them on a large solid silver table. And all the time they feasted and laughed and jested, delicate music and singing wafted towards them from the far end of the boat, to charm their ears if they cared to listen. While, though, the awning sheltered them from the sun, it also concealed from them a little cloud which presently appeared in the sky, and the music, talk, and laughter drowned the sound of a little breeze that sighed round the vessel. The little breeze sighed and went away unnoticed, but presently returned, not little now, but very big, and determined to be heard. But they were by this time making such a noise on board that even the louder breeze went unheeded, until, grown quite angry, in a gust of fury it struck the boat. And what happened next no one knows, for none were left to tell the tale, except the breeze, and he went scuffling off to another point. This only is known, that where the barge had floated, nothing was to be seen but a desolate expanse of water. But for years and years afterwards, when the wind was in the right direction, the fishermen heard sounds of laughter and talking coming up from the bottom of the sea, the rattle of plates and the jingle of glasses, and through it all the strains of sweet music and deep voices singing. If the moon was in the right quarter, and the water very still, far down beneath the waves could be seen the gleaming silver table, and the wicked old Lord of Pengurswick and his guests still seated round, keeping up their revels. The feasting must all have ceased by this time, though for no sound is ever heard now, and it is long since anyone has caught sight of the pleasure-loving crew. A part of the treasure has been cast up by the sea, and seized by the descendants of the poor people the old lord robbed. And it seems quite possible that if they only wait long enough, and the tide goes out far enough, someone will be so fortunate as to find the silver table. Cruel COPPINGER, the Dane. One of the most terrific storms ever known was raging on the north coast of Cornwall. The gale blowing up channel from the southwest broke with such fury on that bold, unsheltered piece of coast by Morwenstow that the wreckers, who were gathered on the shore and heights above, had more than enough to do to keep their feet. The rain came down in driving sheets, shutting off the sea from their eager eyes, so that they could see nothing of the prey they were watching for. Beaten down, drenched, well nigh frozen, even these hardy men were on the point of giving way before the fury of the hurricane, when suddenly, from out of the sheets of driving rain, loomed a vessel, a foreigner. If she had been a phantom ship, as at first they thought she must be, she could not have appeared more strangely, suddenly, or unexpectedly. But it was no phantom battling so bravely, yet so hopelessly with the fierce waves, ploughing her way through them, defying their efforts to draw her down and devour her. She rolled and lurched heavily, and was driven closer and closer onto the jagged rocks of that cruel coast. Her sails were in rags, and she herself was utterly beyond control. As she drew nearer, the terror-stricken faces of those on board could be plainly seen, clinging to each other or to the masts, praying, gesticulating, or too frightened to do anything but gaze with fixed and ghastly eyes at the awful fate awaiting them. Standing near the wheel was a man who, even at such a time, seemed to hold himself apart from the rest. He was of gigantic size, towering above the heads of the rest of them. He had stripped himself of his clothing and was evidently awaiting a suitable moment to plunge off the vessel into the boiling ocean and fight his hand-to-hand battle with death. At last, the right moment came. Without an instant's hesitation, he plunged over the side into the raging waters. Then, rising again in a moment or two to the surface, like a perfect Hercules, he fought his way through the billows, his strong arm and massive chest defying their power. On he went, now riding on the top of a huge boiling mountain of water, now down in the hollow, with the raging sea rising above him, so that it seemed he must be swallowed and crushed in their embrace. Long the struggle continued, and the excitement on shore grew intense, for no one thought it possible that he could reach the land alive. But, after a terrible fight, which would have exhausted anyone not endowed with supernatural powers, his bravery was rewarded, and with one tremendous leap he landed safely on the shore, well beyond the deadly clutch of the waves. All the people of the countryside seemed now to have gathered to witness the marvelous combat, men and women, on horse and on foot, wreckers, fishermen, and what not, and into the midst of them all rushed the dripping stranger, apparently not in the least exhausted. He snatched the scarlet cloak off the shoulders of an old woman and wrapped it about himself. As suddenly sprang up behind a young woman who was sitting on her horse watching the wreck, and urging the animal on to a furious gallop, rode off in the direction of the young woman's home. The people shouted and screamed, for they thought the poor girl was being carried off, no one knew where, by the evil one himself. But the strange cries, which they took to be the language of the lower regions, were only a foreign tongue, and the horse made for its own stable by instinct. When Miss Dinah Hamlin and her reeking steed dashed into the courtyard of her own home, closely clasped by a tall, wicked-looking man wrapped in a scarlet cloak, the outcry was doubled. There was nothing to be done, though, but to give the stranger a suit of Mr. Hamlin's clothes, and some food, and very comely he looked in the long coat, the handsome waistcoat, knee-breeches, and buckled shoes. He accepted the clothes and the food, and indeed all their attention as a matter of course, and having informed them that his name was COPPINGER, and that he was a Dane, he seemed to think he had done all that was required of him, and settled down in the family circle as though he were one of them, and as welcome as though he were an old family friend. Of the distressed vessel and the rest of the shipwrecked crew, nothing more was seen from the moment the big man left her. How or where she disappeared, no one knew. All eyes had been fixed on the struggling swimmer from the moment he leapt into the sea. And when they had looked again, the ship had gone, and no trace or sign of her or her crew was ever found on that coast, or on any other. At first, Coppinger made himself most agreeable. To the people he had appeared amongst, he was pleasant and kind beyond anything you can imagine. Miss Dinah Hamlin thought him a very attractive man indeed, and not only forgave him for his first treatment of her, but thought it something to be proud of. Old Mr. Hamlin liked the man too, and was as kind to him as could be, giving him the best he had, and even at last consenting to his marriage with Miss Dinah herself, though against his own feelings. Coppinger had given out that he was a Dane of noble birth and great wealth, who had run away to escape marrying a lady he disliked. Old Farmer Hamlin did not like his daughter to marry a foreigner, and he considered that people should marry in their own stations. But Dinah herself loved the man all the better for what he had told them, and between them they soon overcame the father's scruples, and the wedding day was fixed. The wedding day had to be postponed, though, for Farmer Hamlin fell ill, grew rapidly worse, and in a very short time was dead and buried. As soon as this was over, a great change came over things. Master Coppinger began to show himself in his true character, and a very black character indeed his was, so black and so bad that for generations his mere name was a terror to the people who lived in that part of the world, and is detested to this day. As soon as poor Farmer Hamlin had passed away, Coppinger made himself master and controller of the house and all in it, even to the smallest domestic affairs. Dinah he persuaded to marry him at once, and hardly had she done so when all the evil in his character made itself known, and as though to make up for having so long suppressed his wicked passions, he utterly threw off all appearance of goodness and respectability, and poor respectable Farmer Hamlin's quiet, happy home became a den of thieves and vagabonds and a meeting place for all the lawless characters in the county. Then it very soon came out that the whole countryside was infested with a body of smugglers, wreckers, poachers, robbers, and murderers, over all of whom Rural Coppinger, as he came to be called by the honest people in the neighbourhood, was captain and ringleader. He and his gang worked their own wicked will, and the poor inhabitants of the place were completely in their power, for there were no magistrates or rich men of power in that part, and no revenue officer dared show himself. The clergyman was scared into silence, and Coppinger and his band ruled the countryside. Very soon a regular system of smuggling was carried on. All sorts of strange vessels appeared on that part of the coast, and were guided by signals to a safe creek or cove, where they were unloaded, and the valuable illegal spoil brought in and hidden in the huge caves, which no one but Coppinger and his crew dared to enter, for it would have meant torture and death. By and by, one particular vessel, the Black Prince, Coppinger's own, which he had had built for him in Denmark, became a perfect terror to all the other vessels in the parts she frequented. Coppinger and his crew sailed the seas as though they belonged to them, robbing, murdering, and doing every evil thing they could think of. If a vessel chased them, they led her into such dangerous parts of the coast that her whole crew invariably perished, while the Black Prince glided out by some intricate passage and got safely off. If one of the poor landsmen offended any of the gang, away he was dragged to Coppinger's vessel and there made to serve until he was ransomed. And as the people were almost reduced to beggary by the rogues, there was very little chance of the poor fellows ever being free again. Wealth poured into their clutches, and Coppinger soon began to have enormous quantities of gold, which he spent lavishly. Amongst other things, he bought a farm which bordered on the sea, but the lawyer to whom he was to pay the money was taken aback at receiving it in coins from pretty nearly every country in the world. Doubloons, ducats, dollars, pistols. At first, he refused to accept them, but a look from Coppinger and a threat made him change his mind. He accepted the coins without another word and handed over the papers. Of course, when Coppinger realized his power and saw how everyone feared him, he grew more and more daring. He closed up bridle paths to which he had no possible right, and made new ones where he had no right to make them, and forbade anyone but his own friends to use them after a certain hour in the evening, and no one dared disobey him. Their roads were called Coppinger's Tracks, and all met at a headland called Steeple Brink, a huge hollow cliff which ran 300 feet sheer up from the beach, while the vast, roomy cave beneath it ran right back into the land. Folk said it was as large as Kilkhampton Church, and they were not far wrong. This was called Coppinger's Cave, and here took place such scenes of wickedness and cruelty as no one can imagine in these days. Here all the stores were kept, wine, spirits, animals, silks, gold, tea, and everything of value that they could lay hands on. No one but the crew ever dared to show themselves there, for it was more than their lives were worth, the crew being bound by a terrible oath to help their captain in any wickedness he might choose to perpetrate. So it came to pass that all, whether of his band or not, gave in to him, and were ruled by him as though they were slaves, and he their lord. His own house, too, was full of misery and noisy, disgraceful scenes. When John Hamlin died, Coppinger had obtained possession somehow of everything belonging to him, with the exception of a large sum of money which went to the widow. Coppinger meant to have this money too, though, so he began by getting small sums from his mother-in-law from time to time, until she at last refused to give him any more, and even his threats and coaxings failed to move her. Cruel Coppinger was not a man to be balked in any way, so he soon hit upon a plan. Taking his wife to her room, he tied her to the post of the great bedstead. Then calling in her mother, he told her that he was going to flog Dinah with the cat-o'-nine-tails which he held in his hand, until she handed over to him the money he had asked her for. They knew quite well that he would be as good as his word, and that refusal meant death by torture to Dinah. So the poor mother was compelled to give in, and finding that this plan answered his purpose so well, he repeated the performance until he had had nearly every penny poor old Mrs. Hamlin was possessed of. Amongst the numerous animals he owned, there was one favourite mare, a vicious, uncontrollable creature, on which he used to scour the country at a terrible pace, spreading terror wherever he went. He never cared in the least how many people or animals he knocked over and trampled to death. The more weak and helpless they were, the more he seemed to love to hurt them. One evening, after spending a few festive hours at a neighbour's house, he was just on the point of departing when he happened to notice, seated by the hearth of a poor little half-witted tailor, who always went by the name of Uncle Tom. He was just on the point of departing when he happened to notice, seated by the hearth, a poor little half-witted tailor, who always went by the name of Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom was a very quiet, extremely nervous little man, well known and pitied by all. He went from house to house all over the countryside, doing a day's work at one house and half a day's at another, and in most houses he was given a meal in addition to his trifling pay, for everyone liked him. He was always willing and obliging, and had never harmed anyone in his life. "Halloa, Uncle Tom!" cried Coppinger boisterously, going up and laying a heavy hand on the thin, shaking shoulder of the little tailor. "We are both bound for the same direction. Come along with me, I'll give you a lift on my mare." The old man shrank away nervously, mumbling all sorts of excuses, for he, above all people, lived in deadly terror of cruel Coppinger, also of his vicious mare, and the idea of being at the mercy of them both nearly scared away what few wits he had. The sight of his terror, though, only made Coppinger more determined to frighten him. He loved to torment so helpless a victim, and the other people present, partly from love of mischief, but chiefly to please Coppinger, egged the tormentor on. In spite of his struggles and entreaties, they hoisted the poor little tailor onto the back of the prancing, restive beast, and held him there while Coppinger sprang up. No sooner were they both mounted than up reared the mare, danced round on her hind legs a time or two, and then sprang away along the road at a rate which it made one gasp to witness. Tom clung in sheer terror to his big tormentor, afraid of falling off, yet afraid to stay on. Coppinger, guessing perhaps that the little man in his terror might spring off, undid his belt and passed it round the little tailor's body, buckling it securely around them both. Then, having fastened his victim to him, beyond all hope of escape, he urged the mare on to a more furious pace than ever. They tore through the air at lightning speed. Tom shrieked and prayed to be put down, to be told whither he was to be taken, what Coppinger meant to do with him, and pleaded to be killed at once rather than tortured. They dashed on past his own little cottage, and his wife at the door, catching sight of the pair, nearly fainted to see her poor husband in the grasp of the tyrant. On they went, and on, without sign of stopping. They leapt ditches and hedges, animals, wagons, people, anything that came in their way, until, coming at last to a steep hill, they slackened their pace a little, and Coppinger condescended to speak. "I promised the devil I would bring him a tailor," he said, "for his clothes sadly need mending, and I am going to carry you to him tonight. It will not be very hard work, and he won't harm you as long as you do what he bids you." So terrified was poor little Uncle Tom on hearing this awful fate, that he had a fit then and there from fright, and the violence of his struggles was such that the belt gave way, and he was flung from the racing mare right into the ditch by the roadside. There he lay all night, and there he was found in the morning, not only battered and bruised and half frozen, but with his poor weak mind quite gone. "He would never sew for the devil," he kept repeating over and over and over again. "He would never sew for the devil, nor for Coppinger either. He believed Coppinger was the devil, and he might do his work himself. Uncle Tom would never work for such as he." Never again did poor Uncle Tom get back his reason, or do another stroke of work to support himself and his wife. But Coppinger had had his joke, and fought it a very fine one. Countless were the cruel pranks he played on the poor, the helpless, and defenseless, until at last people became afraid to go outside their houses, and were afraid to stay in them, for every day brought some new wickedness done by him, and every fresh one was worse than the last. Coppinger had one child, a boy. He was deaf and dumb, and as uncanny a child as his father was a man. He was a beautiful boy to look at, with soft, fair skin and golden hair, but he had his father's cruel eyes and his father's cruel nature. From his babyhood, his mischievousness and wickedness knew no bounds. Any bird or animal or even child that came within his reach, he would torment almost to death, and the more his victim writhed and screamed, the greater was his delight. When he was but 6, he was found one day on the headland, dancing in frantic joy and pointing with gestures of delight to the beach below. Hurrying down, they found the mangled and bleeding corpse of a little child. His companion, whom he had enticed to the edge of the cliff, and, by an unexpected push, sent headlong onto the rocks beneath. From that day he was always to be found on the tragic spot, and when a stranger passed, he would make unearthly sounds of delight, and pointing down to the beach, dance and throw himself about in ecstasy. All this time Coppinger and his gang grew more and more reckless and daring, until they were the scourge of the countryside. To what lengths they might have gone, no earthly powers can tell. But money became scarce and times grew bad for them. Armed king's cutters came, not singly, but in great numbers, and tidings of danger were brought to cruel Coppinger by strangely dressed foreigners. And so at last things came to a climax, and deliverance was at hand for the poor suffering people. Just such another time as preceded Coppinger's arrival burst again on that coast. The rain and hail came down in the sheets. The gale blew furiously all day. At sunset, a vessel appeared off the coast, full rigged. Presently a rocket went up from the Gull Rock, a little rock island with a creek on the land side, a spot where many smugglings had taken place. A gun answered from the ship. Again both signals were sent up. Then, on the topmost peak of the rock, appeared the huge form of Coppinger. He waved his sword, and a boat immediately put off from the ship, with 2 men at each oar, for the tide is terribly strong just there. They neared the rock, rowed boldly through the surf, and was steered into the Gull Creek by someone who evidently knew the coast well. Then Coppinger, who was standing impatiently awaiting them, leapt on board and took the command. Their efforts to get back to the vessel were enormous. Like giants, they laboured at their oars to force a path through the boiling, seething waters. Once, as they drew off shore, one of the rowers, either from loss of strength or of courage, relaxed his hold for a moment. In an instant, a cutlass waved above his head, and one swift, cruel stroke cut him down. It was the last brutal deed the cruel Coppinger was ever seen to do. He and his men reached the ship and got on board. What happened afterwards no one knows, for at the same moment she disappeared like some ghostly phantom ship. Nobody knows where or how. Then, in even more fearful violence than before, the storm raged and beat on that coast. Hail, thunder, lightning, hurricanes of wind blinded, deafened, or killed all who were exposed to it. Round Coppinger's home it expended the very utmost of its fury. Trees were torn up by the roots, the thatch was blown off the outhouses, chimneys fell, windows were blown in. And, as Dinah, terrified by the uproar and destruction, racing round her, stood holding her uncanny child in her arms, through the roof and ceiling came crashing a monstrous thunderbolt, surrounded by flames, and fell hissing at the very foot of cruel Coppinger's chair. Madge Figgy, the Wrecker. Those of you who know Land's End and that part of it called Tol Pen Penwith cannot fail to have been struck by a huge cliff there, in shape like a ladder or flight of steps, formed of massive blocks of granite piled one upon another, and on the top of which there is perched what looks like, and is, a monstrous granite chair. Madge Figgy's chair is its name, for in it Madge Figgy, who was a wrecker by trade, used to sit and call up the storms, and here, while the rough, cruel Atlantic boiled and lashed in impotent fury over the face of the ladder, Madge sat, cool and unconcerned, keeping a sharp lookout for any vessels coming in on that terrible coast. As well as being a wrecker, Madge Figgy was one of the most cruel and wicked witches in the county, and hour after hour she would sit in her chair plotting mischief, or hurling curses at any unfortunate person or thing who had happened to offend her. The poor country folk were afraid of their very lives of her, and whatever wicked things she told them to do, they had to do them, for they knew her power and lived in terror of offending her. Amongst the witches, she was the leader in all their frolics and revels and wickedness. Getting astride her broomstick, she would fly right away across the sea to some foreign land, a band of her friends and cronies after her. And right well did they enjoy themselves, which was more than anyone else did who came across them while on their wicked revels. Madge Figgy's home was in a little cottage in a cove, not far from her ladder and chair. And this cove was a nest of a gang of the worst wreckers in Cornwall, gathered together by old Madge to help her in her cruel work. No one can count how many noble vessels they lured onto the rocks of that dangerous coast, how many bodies they stripped and cast back into the sea again, while, as for the treasure they had divided amongst themselves, they had quite enough to live on for the rest of their lives, even if they never did another stroke of mischief. That, though, was not what they cared about. They loved wrecking and robbing, and all their evil ways, and would have been quite miserable if they had had to live quiet, respectable, stay-at-home lives, where all was so wicked there were none to shame them into being any better, and they flaunted their stolen riches as shamelessly as though they had come by everything honestly. It was quite a common sight to see the great clumsy countrywomen and girls going about their work dressed in costly silks and velvets, all of the richest character and most beautiful colouring, digging and ploughing, cooking and scrubbing with valuable jewellery on their great arms and their coarse red hands, sparkling gems in their ears, and very likely a tiara that would have made a queen envious, fastened round their untidy, unbrushed hair. Of all the crew, though, Madge and her husband were the very worst. Most of them did abide by the old saying, "Honour amongst wreckers," but not those two. If they could cheat or trick even their friends, they would do so, and did, too, very often. One particularly stormy day, Madge Figgy sat in her great chair in high glee. A tempest such as was seldom known, even on that coast, was raging round her, and close onto the rocks below her was drifting a Portuguese Indiaman, which she had lured in to be dashed to fragments on the terrible rocks by the boiling, maddening breakers which towered up like mountains, then broke and fell with all their force on the helpless vessel. Madge Figgy kicked her heels and clapped her hands with joy as she watched, for the huge vessel, laden with valuables of the costliest kind, was a prize such as they did not often get. And Madge, in her mind, was already reckoning up her gains. Far better for the Indiaman had she dropped her treasure overboard and sent it to the bottom of the sea, where she would be ere long, for Madge could tell at any distance what a ship's cargo was worth, and if it was a small one, she let the vessel sail on in peace. Up aloft was the old witch dancing and singing, and down below struggled the perishing crew, captain, sailors, passengers, men, women and children, shrieking aloud for help, but seeing never a living creature coming to give them a hand. Their cries might have melted hearts of iron, but not the hearts of those who were hiding behind the rocks, watching, with greedy interest for the moment when they might go down and seize their prey. One by one the cries ceased, as the sea swallowed up the poor struggling creatures. Then presently the vessel broke up, and in on the waves came floating cases, casks, chests, broken spars, mingled with the dead bodies of men and women and little babies. As fast as they appeared, they were seized on and quickly stripped of everything that was of value. The ladies were robbed of their jewels and dresses, and even of their long hair, and even the babies were robbed of the necklaces which still hung around their chubby necks. When the bodies were stripped, they were not thrown into the sea again, but were carried away and buried in a great green hollow near Cove, with a stone at the head of each to mark the spot. Though the graves cannot be distinguished now, the hollow may yet be seen. For weeks after the wreck of the Portuguese Indiamen, the wreckers were continually finding gold and jewels washed into the sand, and now and again more bodies were washed ashore, all richly dressed. Oh, it was a fine haul the wreckers had after that black storm. But one very curious thing happened, such as had never happened before. Amongst the bodies washed in was that of a beautiful lady, dressed in the richest of robes and wearing more magnificent jewelry than any of the other poor creatures. In addition to her jewelry, too, she had, fastened about her, a very large amount of money and treasure, as though, poor lady, she had thought that she could not only save herself, but a great deal else as well. When Madge Figgy, who had claimed this body, had finished stripping it, she stood gazing at it very attentively for a long time. She appeared to be troubled about something, almost frightened in fact. And turning to the rest of the gang, she forbade them to divide any of the spoil, or even to touch a single thing. There was a fine row at that, of course, for they had all been counting on a rich share, and they vowed they would have it too. They quarrelled and fought, and a good deal of blood was spilt. But Madge took care of herself, and got the better of them all too, for it would have taken more than a gang of wreckers to outwit that wicked old woman. She declared that there was a mark on the body which she understood, though no one else could, and that if they divided any of the things belonging to it, ill luck would befall them all, and no one knew where it would end. "Trust a witch to know a witch," she cried. Got her way, as she generally did, for they were all afraid of her, and everything belonging to the poor lady was put into a chest which stood in Madge's kitchen, while the body was carried to the hollow and buried with the others. The very night, though, after they had laid her in her grave, a very curious thing happened. Out from the grave there came, as soon as darkness fell, a little blue light. For a moment it flickered and gleamed on the newly made mound, and glided swiftly away, up over the cliffs until it reached Madge Figgy's great granite chair. Up into the chair it glided, and there it stayed for a long time, a weird, mysterious gleam, looking most uncanny in the darkness. Then out of the chair it glided and made its way to Madge Figgy's cottage, where it floated across the threshold and straight to the chest where the dead lady's belongings lay. All the wreckers were watching it, and all, except old Madge, were very nearly terrified out of their senses. They felt sure that at last their wickedness was to meet with its punishment, that the evil one had come to carry them away, and their hours on earth were numbered. Madge Figgy tried hard to laugh away their fears and cheer them up. She wanted no chicken hearts about her, men who would refuse to take part in her wicked work or even carry tales where she did not want them carried. "Get along, you great stupids, you!" cried Madge, trying to put some spirit into them. "It will all come right in time. I know all about it." It took a long time, though, and the people began to lose faith in Madge's cleverness. For 3 long months the little blue flame crept out of the dead lady's grave at nightfall, glided to Madge Figgy's chair, and then to the chest in the cottage, and nothing could stop it. At the end of 3 months, when the people of the cove were feeling they could not bear this thing any longer, there came to Madge's cottage one day a curiously dressed stranger. From his appearance, all who saw him concluded that he was a foreigner, but from what part of the world he came no one could tell, for never a word escaped his lips. Madge Figgy's old husband, who was home alone when the stranger arrived, was very nearly scared to death. Firstly, because the sight of a stranger always frightened any of that wicked crew, and secondly because of the man's signs and curious gesticulations. Old Figgy thought he was a madman, sure enough. After some time, though, and a good many signs and misunderstandings, the old man gathered that the stranger wished to see the graves of the poor souls who went down in the wreck of the Portuguese Indiaman. Old Figgy put on his cap readily enough to show him the way, only too thankful to get him out of the house. But as soon as ever they had started on the right road, the stranger did not need any further guidance. He walked on by himself straight to the hollow, and making his way direct to the grave of the Portuguese lady, he threw himself on it passionately, and broke into the most violent outburst of grief imaginable. For some time old Figgy stood watching him in astonishment, until the foreigner, looking up, caught sight of him, and signed to him to go away. Then returning to the grave again, he threw himself on it once more, and stayed there weeping and moaning until nightfall. When darkness crept on, up rose the little blue flame from the grave as before. But instead of going to Madge Figgy's chair, it made its way to the cottage, and gliding onto the chest, gleamed there with twice its usual brilliancy. The foreigner, who had followed the flame closely, went, without let or hindrance from the old witch or anyone, straight to the chest, and clearing away with one sweep all the rubbish and lumber which were piled on it, opened it as if he had known it all his life, picked out everything in it that had belonged to the lady, then, without touching anything else that the chest contained, closed it again, and after giving liberal gifts to every wrecker in the place, departed as mysteriously as he had come. Anything of his history, or whence he came, was never discovered, but from the moment he left Madge Figgy's cottage, neither he nor the little blue flame was ever seen again by any of them. How Madge Figgy got her pig. Madge Figgy, as you already know, spent most of her life in injuring someone. After she had left her cottage by the sea, where she spent so much of her time in robbing the dead, she went to live in St. Buryan, and there she spent her time in robbing the living, and doing any other mischief that came into her head to do. One of her victims here was her near neighbour, Tom Trenower, a hard-working, struggling man who spent all his days trying to make both ends meet, and mostly failing, poor fellow. Now Tom had a sow, a fine great creature, on which he set great store, for when she was fattened up enough, he meant to take her to Penzance market, where he hoped to sell her for at least 20 shillings, for she was worth that, and more, of any man's money. As ill luck would have it, though, Madge Figgy caught sight of the sow one day, and from that moment she could not rest until she had got it for herself. Over she bustled to Tom's house in a great hurry. "Tom," she said, "I've taken a fancy to that sow of yours, and I'll give ye 5 shillings for her now, this very minute, if you'll sell her. 4 would be a good price, but I've set my mind on having her, and I don't mind stretching a point for a friend." "I ain't going to sell her now," said Tom. "I'm fattening her up for market, and it's a long sight more than 5 shillings. So keep your money, Madge. You may want it yet," he added meaningly. "Very well," replied the witch, shaking her finger at Tom and wagging her head. "I won't press ye to sell the pig, but mark my words, before very long you will wish you had." And away she went without another word. Poor Tom. He did mark her words, and many a time he remembered them with sorrow, for from the moment they were uttered, his sow began to fail. She ate and drank as much as ever he chose to give her, and seemed to enjoy her food, too. But instead of growing fatter, she grew leaner and leaner, and from being a fine great beast, nearly fit for a Christmas market, she became a poor, spare-looking thing that no one would say thank you for. "Are you willing to sell her now, Tom?" cried cruel old Madge, popping her head round the door of the pigsty one day when Tom was feeding the animal. "No, and I wouldn't sell her to you for her weight in gold," cried Tom, too desperate now to care whether he offended the woman or not. "So get home to your own house, you ill-wishing, cross-grained old witch." Madge Figgy only smiled. "Don't lose your temper, Tom, my dear," she said sweetly. "'Tis for me to do that. Just wait a bit, and I'll be bound that before another week is out, you'll be glad to get rid of her, even to me." And away trotted the mischievous old creature, cackling to herself and rubbing her hands with glee. "I'll fatten the pig up somehow," cried Tom desperately, and he began giving her more than double her usual quantity of food at each meal. He gave her enough, indeed, to fatten 2 pigs, and nearly ruined himself to do it. But the more she ate, the thinner she grew, and before the week was out, she was merely skin and bone. "I can't afford to spend more on ye," said Tom sorrowfully, and he made up his mind to take her to market the very next day, before she got any worse. So early the following morning they started off to walk to the market. Tom tied a string around the sow's leg to prevent her running away, but there was little enough fear of her doing that, for the poor thing could scarcely stand for weakness. In fact, she kept on falling down from sheer inability to support herself, and Tom had to pick her up and put her on her feet again, for she had not got the strength to get up by herself. After a long time, for they only went at a snail's pace, they came to the high road. "I believe I'll have to take and carry her on my back," Tom said dolefully, "or we shan't get to market till night." But hardly had he spoken the words when the sow took to her heels and ran as if she had been a stag with the hounds after her. Poor Tom was nearly shaken to bits. His arms were pretty nearly dragged from his body, for over hedges and ditches she went, and over everything else that came in her way, dragging Tom after her, until at last he had to drop the rope and let her take her chance, for his strength was all gone, and he had no breath left. As soon, though, as Tom let go his hold of the rope, the creature stopped her mad race and walked along as quietly and soberly as the best-behaved pig that ever breathed. She went, though, every way but the right one, and this she did for mile upon mile, taking Tom after her, until at last they came to Tregenninbris Downs. Here, where the 2 roads branch off, the one to Sancreed and the other to Penzance, Tom caught hold of the rope again and tried once more to lead her to market. But the moment she came to the crossroads, the sow started off at full speed again, jerking the rope out of Tom's hand and careering away by herself until she got under Tregenninbris Bridge. Here, though, she was forced to stop, for she stuck fast and could not move backwards or forwards. For Tregenninbris Bridge was a queer, old-fashioned construction, more like a big drain-pipe than anything, except that it was smaller in the middle than at the ends. Consequently, as she could not go through it and come out the other side, and she would not come back, she had to stay where she was. Tom did not know what to do. He could not reach her to pull her out, and all his hallooing and shouting was so much waste of breath. He pelted her with stones and lumps of turf, first her head and then her tail, until he was tired, but he might just as well have left her, for all the good it did. She only grunted and planted her feet more obstinately. At last, Tom, being quite worn out, sat down to rest and waited to see what she would do if left to herself. But though he waited and waited till evening, the pig never budged. Tom, though, grew so hungry that he hardly knew how to bear with himself. He had had nothing to eat or drink since 5 in the morning, and he had tramped miles upon miles since that time. "There don't seem much chance of the contrary old thing's coming out, so I may as well go home to get some supper," he said at last. "If anybody finds her, they'll know she's mine, for there isn't such another poor miserable creature in the parish. So here goes." But no sooner had he made a start than whom should he see coming towards him but Madge Figgy. Madge was smiling to herself as she walked along, as though she were very pleased about something. "Helloa, Tom Trenowiff," she cried, pretending to be surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Well," said Tom, "that's more than I can tell you, but I ain't here for my own pleasure. I can assure you of that, and if you want to know more, you can look under the bridge and find out for yourself." "What's that grunting in there? Surely never your old sow. Well, she can't have fattened much if she's got in there. Are you in the mind to part with her now, Tom? What will you let me have her for now?" "If you've got a bit of something to eat in your basket, for pity's sake let me have it. For I'm famished, and if you can get the old thing out of that there pipe, you're welcome to her for your trouble," said Tom sullenly, for he felt small at giving in to his enemy after all. "I've got a beautiful little kettle loaf in my basket, Tom. Take it, and welcome do." Tom seized the loaf and began to eat ravenously. "Thank'ee," said he, pretending to smile. "I think I got the best of the bargain, for anyway I've got a good loaf, and it'll take more than you to get out my old pig." "Ha ha!" laughed Madge Figgy. "I'm glad you're pleased, Tom. Refused 5 shillings and took a 2-penny loaf. I'm pleased with my share of the bargain, and I'm glad you are." Then turning towards the pig, she called softly, "Chug, chug, chug, come on, chug, chug, chug." Out walked the old sow at once, and going up to the witch, she trotted away down the road after her as tamely as a dog.